School discipline is supposed to be a way to help students learn and feel safe, but studies have also shown that disciplinary measures such as suspensions can result in problems, meaning anything from dropping out of school to incarceration. There's a new report by the Appleseed Center for Law and Justice about the effect of those measures, along with a pattern of racial disparity on Black female students. To discuss the findings is the center's executive director in Massachusetts, Deborah Silva. Thank you very much for being with us, Deborah.
Thank you for having me.
Deborah, what got this going, especially the focus on Black female students?
Yeah, so Mass Appleseed has been looking at racial disparities since 2012 when we issued a report called Keep Kids in Class, Approaches to School Discipline. And we followed up working with other groups on passing legislation to help address this issue, but the focus on girls didn't really come to my attention, or the need to focus on girls didn't come to my attention until 2017 when the Mystic Valley Charter School in Malden was in the news because of discipline they had imposed on two twin girls because their braids violated the school's dress code policy.
One of the things I was wondering about here is what is meant by a suspension, because at first you would think that suspension is for a certain kind of offense and that there was a standard about this and it was always the same everywhere, but that's not the case, isn't it?
No, that's right. Suspensions are very much school specific. Each school has their own code of conduct and can decide what discipline to impose based on that potential violations of that code of conduct. And there are even different kinds of suspensions. There are in-school suspensions versus out-of-school suspensions, and then of course even more troublesome are expulsions. Any kind of exclusion from school is troublesome though, because it really impacts the students' ability to learn.
What about the effect on female students? I know we're talking about anything down to the worst cases of people who end up being incarcerated, but what about the rest of the spectrum?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think, what our report found was that there were disparities across the board. Based on federal data, we found that Black girls were 3.9%, almost 4% more likely to be disciplined for basically the same behaviors as their white peers. More recent, that data went back to 2015. Unfortunately, the federal data isn't more recent than that, but we're lucky to have access to state data that was more recent and showed some improvement down to 3.3%, but still obviously troublesome disparities that need to be addressed.
Now, one of the things that occurred to me is that the white students who are less likely to be suspended are not necessarily in the same schools. They could be at a different school with a different whole climate about suspensions, right?
That's true. Different districts have different climates, as you mentioned, and even different schools within particular districts sometimes have different climates. Right, the data looked specifically at school data that was submitted to the state and to the federal government across the state. We didn't dig down into the school level data, although that's something we're interested in doing going forward.
Suspensions are a sign of trouble. In the one specific case you mentioned where the girls were penalized for their hairstyles, you might say that's a cultural problem among
that's exactly right.
School. But on the other hand, there could be social and emotional needs of students, needs that maybe are not being addressed. So what do you want people to take away in that direction?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, one of the things our report recommends is, first of all, more data. If we can't identify the problem, we can't even begin to fix it. So we need more robust data collection at the state and federal level. But you're right. I mean, rather than engaging in exclusionary or any kind of, harsh discipline, we recommend taking a look at students' social emotional needs, at having more school counselors, at instituting restorative justice practices and other ways to address any potential problem behavior that doesn't result in this funneling of students into the school to prison pipeline.
Oh, you use a term that I hear from a lot of advocates and educators, restorative justice in a school setting. What would that mean exactly?
So it means different things to different people, but it usually involves bringing the offender together with other members of the community who have been impacted by their behavior, and really entering into a dialogue one-to-one on what happened, why it happened, how it made the person who was the subject of the bad behavior feel. And we've seen really positive results as a result of this kind of approach.
I imagine there's less debate about some kind of disciplinary measure when it involves a serious offense or even something violent. But there are schools, and I think this is still the case somewhat, where suspensions are for things that other people might look upon as minor. What about those?
That's right, and that's really what we're talking about in this report primarily is minor offenses, right? We're not talking about the kids who bring guns to school or drugs to school. You know, we think that there needs to be a different set of consequences for those kids, and I'm not an educator. I'm not going to say exactly what those consequences should be, but for instance, in the example in Malden, you know, hairstyle violations should not result in children being or students being threatened with suspension. You know, those girls had multiple detentions. They were denied the ability to participate in the prom. They were denied the ability to participate in sports, and we just don't think that makes any sense.
Well, you pore over this data, and there are a lot of advocates and policy people who do that. I think they're familiar with the racial disparities. They're not totally new. But what about students? Do you think the students are aware of this, even subliminally? And if so, what does that do to their head?
That's exactly right. I do think that they're aware. I think that we're seeing more and more of them speaking out, particularly this summer in light of the Black Lives Matter movement. I think it does affect their perception of themselves. I think the message that they receive is that they're not important, that what happens to them doesn't matter. And I think that gets internalized. And I think that's part of why we often see them heading down this path towards involvement with the criminal justice system. And we really need to interrupt that pipeline.
Well, one of the things that you're contending with too here in terms of perceptions, I think a lot of people might automatically think that, well, with girls, it's not as bad, that it couldn't possibly be as serious, that they're not doing these things that we think boys do. But why is it a serious concern for girls?
Yeah, well, one of the reasons that we took a look at this in this report is that I was really frustrated that the narrative has been primarily around the effect that school discipline disparities have on boys. And, you know, we're basically ignoring 50% of the population and the impact on them, which is real, you know, which is just as real as the impact on boys. They, you know, again, their self-esteem is impacted, and their ability to sort of see themselves, to imagine themselves heading out into the world and succeeding is really impacted.
You mentioned some of the work that's been done, and I think a lot of this is around Boston and changing the narrative, changing policies. Do you see anything hopeful there?
I do. I mean, you know, there was a recent settlement in Boston that was really impressive. Greater Boston Legal Services was working with the Boston Public Schools around an issue related to a 17-year-old Black girl in Boston who had been planning her school prom, became upset because the budget was slashed, and left the classroom to go talk to someone about it, and ultimately was approached by 4 police officers aggressively and backed into the lockers, and she really panicked and cried. And that was a very tragic situation, but a great result was that the schools came to the table and negotiated with Greater Boston Legal Services, and I think are taking really positive steps towards improving in this area. The other thing, we've seen improvements since 2012 when Chapter 222 was passed that created some due process rights for students. But we do need to push for further improvements. And, you know, in particular, we're looking at, you know, again, as part of this whole racial awakening this summer at the issue of police brutality. And one thing we really need to include in that conversation is a look at police in schools.
I should mention, of course, here, Lawyers for Civil Rights have been looking in this issue as well for a number of years. Finally, if people want to see this report in full, I think you have a website where they can find it.
That's right. It's massappleseed.org.
Okay, well, thank you very much for being with us, Deborah Silva.